Assalamu alaikum everyone, I'm Azhar Imran and I'm back with my second part of the lecture series on current affairs CSS. In our first part of the lecture we had discussed and made course content analysis of CSS current affair, in which I primarily talked about the structures of course outlines of CSS and how to prepare for them and what you need to study about that, looking at some of the topics. In this video, in this part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about our teaching methodology as a teacher of current affair, how I engage with the students in my class to help them to prepare the current affair and to score maximum in for their CSS exam. So let me briefly give the idea of the teaching methodology. For example, I don't believe in teaching the student in a traditional method, in a traditional way, just to deliver the lecture and students can go back, read them and prepare. Because what I discussed in my first part of the video, that the most of the questions are very conceptual, very critical, very analytical, and they involve multiple angles and perspective. So you cannot simply go and make a traditional preparation if you want to score good if you want to score good in CSS current affair. And one particular current affair and its international affairs part is extremely important for CSS as well. So let me briefly give you the outlines of my teaching methodology. Before I start with my orientation lecture, in which I explain the course outlines, making the generic course outline into more specific course outlines, looking at the past papers and looking at the past papers questions that have been asked in current affairs, and of course that helps us to design the broader angles of a particular topic. So once in my orientation class I have discussed the past papers of current affairs CSS and then past previous questions, and I have broadly made specific topics of each generic course outline. So this makes it clear to the students that what actually they need to prepare in a particular specific topic. Then I move on to my most important part, that is the beginning of the formal lectures. For example, I don't only begin with delivering the formal lectures. Students generally have been emailed all of the course outlines as well as reading material, and of course I will be talking about reading material and resource, how to prepare for the CSS current affair in my next video. But here I'm going to talk about again about the teaching methodology. So as we begin and move towards our formal lecture, the students are provided the course outlines, and each course outline with specific topics that each course outline would be discussed in the class. Once the students have been emailed the course outlines, the students are provided the reading material as well. I have my own reading material for the current affair because to read current affair is perhaps one of the most challenging tasks for CSS because the topics are very generic, as I discussed earlier. So I have my own reading material, what I call current affairs course pack. It is both available in hard copy as well as in soft copy. So it is emailed to the students who want it in soft copy, and otherwise students are instructed to get the hard copy form from the Kips printing office. So once the reading material has been provided to them, they have been given already the course outline. Each of the students gets the weekly schedule and they are told in upcoming week what topics they will be discussed. So it is extremely encouraged and mandatory for the students that they do come with advanced reading of the topics they are going to study in upcoming lecture. So once the student come in advanced reading of the topic, in my first 45 minutes to 60 minutes, I talk about lecture, its different dimensions as mentioned in the course outlines, explaining the factors and how to understand a particular topic, and of course during that taking students' questions and engaging into debate and discussion. And once I have explained all the dimensions and angles of a topic in 45 to 60 minutes, for next 10 to 15 minutes, I look at the past papers of CSS current affairs and look at that how many times this topic has been asked in the previous exam and what are the different dimensions or angles or perspective that have been asked in the question. For example, if you look at the 2020 current affair topic paper CSS, if you look at the 2020 CSS current affair paper, the question that was asked on the Middle East was the role of GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Arab League and African League in the Middle East peace process and conflict. So this is again it was a surprise for many of the teachers even, because normally if you look at the current affair paper of previous years, Middle East is extremely important. So every year there has been a question from the Middle East. But from last almost 10 years, the role of the organization, the regional organization of the Middle East was not asked. But this time the examiner asked this. So eventually I had to add up another topic into my new lectures on the Middle East to let the students know what has been the role of these organizations. So once I deliver the lecture, in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I look at the past papers, I look at the past questions asked from that topic, and I make sure that we have covered in the lecture all of the angles and perspective of a topic which are neutral topic as well as which has been asked in the previous papers. And if we did not cover any of the dimension, in the next 10 to 20 minutes I would explain those dimensions and making it clear to the students how to relate that particular dimension with a broader perspective and the angle of that topic. And then of course for next 10 to 15 minutes I will take the students' questions, and answering those questions, taking students' comments, addressing students' general queries, and then in the last 10 to 15 minutes of my lecture I would be explaining how to attempt a CSS current affair question. Because if I can speak from my experience, many of the talented students end up unfortunately scoring very average or lower than the expected question, lower than the expected marks in their papers of CSS, particularly in current affair. Why? Because students focus more on the content, on the knowledge part, but they focus less on the method and writing structure. Because if you look at the current affair, so current affair requires a particular vocabulary, a particular language, and an empirical understanding of the topic. Of course, the qualitative understanding of the topic and the debates revolving around that topic, and then of course a very sound analysis involving economic, politics, regional actors, global actors, and then of course driving it in the context of Pakistan if there is a relevancy of Pakistan to that problem, and then of course drawing it to the conclusion. So in last 10 to 15 minutes of my lecture, I explain to the students how to write the answer of this topic if there is a question in the exam out of this topic. And the answer of a current affair paper has to be properly structured, in which I talked about how you can develop your introduction, looking at of course different statements of the question, then of course a paragraph, a very sound paragraph on brief analysis of historical development with respect to that topic. Then if there is any definition or any kind of term that needs to be explained, that explanation, and then we start with the broader, what we call the body of the question or the answer, the structure of the answer that involves the explanation of that statement and detailed answer, and then of course ending up to the conclusion, critical analysis part, and then moving on to the conclusion part and how you have to properly sum up the conclusion. There are different methods to write about a conclusion. Similarly, how to draw the critical analysis. There are different approaches to draw the critical analysis as well. So and of course there are different methods to develop the introduction as well. So in that part I explain in detail how you have to talk about and write about your introduction, talk about and write introduction, because the introduction has broadly three parts. That first you immediately start with the statement of the question, then of course you give a brief explanation of that topic, and then of course in the third part of your introduction you in detail talk about the brief points of your answer that you're going to have detailed answer in your paper. So this is how you have to build and develop your introduction. About analysis part, in critical analysis there are two broader approaches that you have to adopt. First, you look at the different policy failures and implications of a particular topic and what has been its impact, and if these policies had not been adopted, what would have been the different thing. So you look at the review, it's a kind of review analysis of the past policies and impacts of that particular policy. And then of course you look at the possible options or policies are the policies that have been adopted and how these policies can be implemented, and of course challenges and threats with respect to these policies or these options. This is called the critical analysis part, that you look at both the pros and cons of a particular topic and angle in the context of policy dimension, and then of course you conclude. And conclusion is generally comprising of two parts. One, you give a brief summary of your answer of the question, and second, you talk about some of the challenges that we can face in the future with respect to adopting the policies with respect to this topic. For example, if you're going to talk about the peace process of Middle East and future peace process of the Middle East, so you can talk about how the peace process facing multiple dimensional challenges, for example, competing regional political and economic interests, competing regional and political global powers, politics interests, and some of the non-state actors which can actually pose a threat. So this is how you draw the conclusion as well. So this is what the teaching methodology we adopt in our classes. Then of course, apart from this particular method that we adopt in our classes, the students are more than welcome to come up with their writing assignments once the lecture is done. Next week they are given the particular question with respect to topics that we covered, and they're asked to write an assignment, and they come to our current affair Center for Excellence, what known as Current Affairs CSS Kips helping desk, to get their assignments checked, and I also gave them the review and the feedback. And of course, I also, one of the most important things that I would like to end my second part of the lecture here is the role of vocabulary. Unfortunately, the students did not look at the vocabulary while attempting the current affair question. It's very important that particular vocabulary, particular words are used which give a clear meaning with reference to the current affair if you want to score 60 plus in your current affair. Thank you very much.